I'm jumping in at the beginning of this video to say that this was recorded over 2 years ago at this point, and has just been rotting on my hard drive ever since. And I'm saying this because I decided to release the video now because I'm getting back into working on the project. And if you're interested in seeing how I much improve on this since then, make sure to subscribe and I'll post the update sometime later this month. Anyway, I hope you enjoy what is not the best example of programming that you've ever seen, but I hope it's at least entertaining. To get started, I needed to collect images for all the different Pokemon. I thankfully found a dataset online that had a lot of high quality images, but unfortunately for me, they weren't exactly sorted in the way that I wanted to sort them. So I had to extract it and then go in and basically clean it up, take out all of the different Alolan forms and the Mega Evolutions and the Gigantamaxes that I just didn't want to be a part of the application. And then I just deleted all those images. But some of the images needed a little bit of cleanup, like Frillish here, it has both of the versions of Frillish. So I needed to take that into Pixlr real quick and just get rid of the other one, so it's just one Pokemon in that like square image. And then I needed to go and download the rest of the images, because there was actually only up until Legends Arceus in this dataset, so I needed to download the rest of Gen 9. And now that I have all of the Pokemon images downloaded, I needed to get all of the information for all the Pokemon. With a combination of ChatGPT and Replit, I created a program that would parse the Poke API and get all of the data for all the Pokemon in JSON files. And then with a little bit of cleanup work on that as well, I got all of the JSON files prepared. So, after I got all of the images imported, as well as all of the JSONs imported, I started working on the basic, scene layout. So, I did some work on the main menu screen and made sure that the buttons and layouts and stuff would be organized properly. And I also put some work into making sure that it would scale properly, so then I can have this application work on multiple different devices and everything would still stay in place. Then I started working on the play screen, and then getting into some of the scripts that I had to create for it. First, I needed a JSON reader, and this script was basically to take the information from the JSON files and put them into an actual usable format for the program. So here's the JSON reader script, and basically what it's doing is it is taking in all of the JSON files at the top, and then it is putting them into different Pokemon lists. So basically I have this class here for Pokemon Info, which is basically a list of all the information for the Pokemon that is actually being pulled from these JSON files. Then there's another class called Pokemon List, which takes all this Pokemon information classes and then puts them into a list. And then there's a Pokemon list, basically, and what that is doing is giving me the ability to separate all of these Pokemon lists into their individual generations. So then if you wanted to, you could go into the options menu, for example, and select that you only want to do who's that Pokemon with Gen 1 and Gen 2 Pokemon, and then I can just have that sort of separation in place. And then in this actual awake function here, we're just taking the information from the JSON files, reading them, and then applying them to the list. Then I needed some way to actually take this information and combine it with the images, so then I didn't have to do multiple steps later to try and combine the two and do a bunch of searches during the actual runtime. So I created this script called Pokemon Builder, and what this does is it basically takes in the JSON reader with all of the lists that we created, and puts them into new lists with the added images in place. So here I have a method called getImages. So what this method is doing is finding the image in the files, turning it into a list of bytes, and then writing it into a texture 2D image, and then adding it to a list of images. And then in the create list method here, basically what I'm doing is I'm iterating all of the lists that were created, and then iterating all of the Pokemon in those lists, and then taking the information from that and then adding the images on top of that to create a final Pokemon list. And all these cases are to again split that into the multiple different generations. And then at the end here is all the classes that I use. So This is the Pokemon Final class, which has the information from the JSON reader and then the image as well. And then this is a constructor that creates that Pokemon Final object. And this is a Pokemon Final list class, which allows me to separate them into the different generations and put them into different lists. For example, when I was creating the getImages script, I was using a reference to a variable instead of creating a new variable. So when the images were being added to the list, they were all referencing the same variable. And then when the final image was added to that list, every single image was still referencing that one variable that was now changed to the last image that we added. So a little bit of an oversight there, and I just had to fix that up, but that was pretty easy. The other problem that I had was not as easy. I basically just, the sorting list, the Pokemon Builder, wasn't working at all, and it took me a really long time to figure out why that wasn't working. So basically, overall, creating these two scripts took me about 8 or 9 hours, if I recall correctly, and it was definitely not easy. Although the way that I had these scripts set up encountered a little bit of an issue. It takes roughly 20-something seconds, between 20 and 30 seconds to run. And this is supposed to happen at the beginning of the program every single time you start it, which is not sustainable, not to mention the fact that that's being run on my computer. This is a mobile application. What is 20 to 30 seconds on my computer could be like an hour on a phone. So I clearly had to do something about it. After multiple failed attempts, at this point, I was spending more time trying to avoid doing something than it would have taken if I had just done that from the start. So I bit the bullet, I sat down for like an hour, and I just put in all the images by hand. I did a lot of work on the UI, so let's take a look at that real quick. So first of all, I created this layout so that you can choose what generations that you actually want to play the game with, and this saves when you go out of it, as well as, obviously, you're not allowed to select 0 generations, so it doesn't let you. As well as, all this gets saved when you leave. And then this is another thing that I'm going to be working on is the silhouettes. So like in the original Who's That Pokemon, like on the actual episodes of the anime, it would show like a silhouette of the Pokemon rather than the actual image. So I'm going to have an option for both, having the image itself and having the silhouettes, and then this will be the toggle for that, which also saves. I also want to put out a little disclaimer that this isn't what the UI is going to look like when it's done, and you'll probably see that later in the video, but I just wanted something that could work so I could work on the systems at hand, and then I'll go back and make it look pretty after. And then let's get into the actual code of it. So for this, I created a UI controller, a toggle script, as well as a game manager, and a game manager spawner. So this is really easy, it just checks if there's already a game manager, and if there's not, it spawns one. And then a lot of stuff is going on in these scripts, so I'm not going to be able to explain it very well now that I've actually gone through and done it all. I should have been recording this as I was doing it, but the thought just didn't cross my mind, so now I have to kind of explain this after the fact. So let's go piece by piece. When the game starts, it calls do not destroy on load for this, which will make it so that the game manager will transfer between the different scenes of the game. Then it takes a range of generations, so this is a vector 2 array, and what that is going to is an array of all the ranges that the generations occupy, and this will be important for selecting what random Pokemon has appeared, and adds those to the active generations. So when you toggle things on the options screen, it'll add them or remove them from the active generations, and that'll tell the Pokemon selector what ranges to use. And then the next bit right here is reorganize active generations. So basically what this is doing is it is checking through this gen toggles, which is this boolean up here. It's checking which one of the generations are selected and then adding those to the active generations. Then we have a bunch of getters and setters for all of the variables that I'm using. So the variables up here, we have the gen toggles, and this is a boolean of which generations are currently active. We have silhouettes, which checks if this silhouettes toggle is currently active. We have toggle count, which checks how many of the generations are selected. We have toggles enabled, and this boolean is for disabling the last checkmark box so that you can't turn all of them off at once. So next up is this toggle script, and in here we have a boolean array gen toggle silhouettes, all these that were present on the game manager are also present on here, and they pass back and forth to each other. And this also has a toggle array, so I can actually modify the toggle elements in the UI itself. So first up is on enable, and basically what this is doing is when this game object is enabled, it will go through all of the toggles and make sure that they are still checked or unchecked based on what it was before. So this is for coming back to the screen to make sure everything is the way it was left. And then in this update function, what I am doing is I am checking if the toggle count is 1, so when there's only one toggle left active, and then disabling that toggle so you can't turn them all off. Then I have all of these methods, which are what go into the actual toggles in the menu. So like this, for example. So the toggle controller here, and then toggles.silhouettes toggle. That's right here. So these are the actual methods that are being called when you click on the toggles. And these are basically checking if the toggle is enabled. And if it's enabled, it's setting it to false and removing it from the count. Or if it is not enabled, it's setting it to true and adding to the count. And then all of these are the same. And then these are all the getter and setter methods for all the variables that are shared between the game manager and the toggle script. So next up is the UI controller, and this is what controls all of the buttons and stuff that are on the UI. So in Awake here, this is basically so when I go to the options screen, it makes sure that the toggles variables are all set to the what game manager had stored. And then in the back button, so when you're going out of the options menu, this will make sure that all the values that toggles has are being sent back to the game manager. And then these are all just methods for the different buttons. So the options buttons sends you to the options scene, play button sends you to the play scene, and back button sends you to the back scene after doing all that. And now we get into the actual meat of the program, the actual gameplay. The Pokemon selection and the guessing mechanic is what I would say if I didn't break it. Basically, at some point, the JSON reader stopped working. I don't know what I did to break it, but I need to fix that first. Since I was kind of stumped on what might be causing the issue, I actually got on call with Solomon Gumball. I'm in their Discord server, I'm following the progress on their game, which if you haven't heard of Solomon Gumball, they're working on a Mario Kart-esque, like, skiing game, which is really cool, and I'm very interested in the development of it. While we were on call, he noticed that these other classes in JSON Reader did not derive from mono behavior, but the one that I made in Pokemon Info did. And when I tested putting this back into JSON Reader and that didn't work, I must have forgotten to remove mono behavior. It had mono behavior in it. That was the problem. So thanks to Solomon, I got the project working again. And I even made it so that the images, there was a button for the images to filter through. And this isn't only looking for images, this is also grabbing the information from JSON Reader, so then I can go on to check if the user guesses it right. I put some work into the actual gameplay, so now it actually checks your input and sees if it's right. How do you spell Happini? I don't know how to spell Happini. I have a threshold, which I will eventually allow the user to adjust themselves. Right now it's set to 95%, so if you have it at least 95% correct, then it'll mark it as correct. But I don't know how to spell Happini. It's not supposed to do that. One moment. Alright, so I fixed that little issue, but anyway. What the heck? So I fixed that little issue, so this should work now. Never mind, I've broken it more. So I fixed that problem. Now it should work. Yep. And then say I got this wrong. It's wrong. And then if I type it right, it's correct. And now let's get into the code. So over here in the game manager, I have a new method called getActiveGenerations, or getActiveGens. And this is just returning the active generations list here. And then that list, as I showed before, is a list of ranges that the Pokemon generations take up. Then the Pokemon selector here gets the index of the Pokemon that it wants based off of the active generations list. So in here, it takes in the active generations list, and then it figures out how many lists there are and choose a random one, and then from that random list, it returns a random Pokemon from the range of that list. Then over here, this is just to set the image. So you give it the name, the index of the Pokemon, and then it finds it in the list of images and sets the image sprite. Then this actual select Pokemon script, it's just getting the index from this method, and then getting the Pokemon data for that Pokemon from that index by get Pokemon by num, and that's over here in JSON reader. I added a new function. You input the number of the Pokemon and it'll find it in all of the lists here. Then these are debug stuff, and then it just sets the image. Then over here in the UI controller, I had to make a couple changes as well. So now I have a submit button, and this is basically, it's going to Pokemon guessing, which is this script here. And this is a very complicated setup for this, but basically I have a threshold, and this is going through and getting the name of the Pokemon and the input that you put, and checking each character to see if they're correct, and then adding to a number correct, so the number of characters that are correct. And then this is checking if the number of correct characters divided by the number of characters in the Pokemon's name is greater than or equal to the threshold of correct characters you can have, and if it is, then it returns that it's true, it is correct, and if it isn't, it returns false, that it is wrong. And the reason I do the number correct divided by the total number, because that division tells you how much of the name was correct. Then back here in UI controller, if this returns true, then it'll start coroutine right, and then these two coroutines, these are just showing that red or green box that I showed you before. And then if it's right, it clears the input and selects a new Pokemon. I'm gonna go through and clean up the UI at some point, but so far, the gameplay is there, and I'm very excited to actually have it in a working state at this point. So really quick, I set up the silhouettes. So now if the silhouette check is checked, and you go into play, the silhouettes are there. And then the code for this was really simple. Basically, I just did a check if silhouette's toggle was active, and then set the color to black, and if it was not active, I set the color to white. So here is the app actually running on my phone. So right now, silhouettes are enabled. I'm actually going to disable them for this, just so I can make sure that it is actually getting correct. But that was correct. For some reason it's not clearing this out. I'll have to fix that. But for the most part, it seems to be working. And then if I go through and disable all these, so only Gen 1 is enabled, should be only Gen 1 Pokemon. Yeah. And there was a little bit lag when it was on the PC, but it seems to be pretty fine now. I went ahead and added a threshold slider. This goes between 0.75 and 1, which I will add those values so you can like see how far it's actually going. And basically what this does is it changes how correct the words have to be. I showed a little bit of this earlier, but this is the actual threshold slider being implemented now. And then the programming for it is really simple. Basically, I just have a slider object, and I'm getting that here. And then I am setting its minimum value to 0.75 and its maximum value to 1. And then I am setting the threshold value to the game manager, because that's how I save it and send it to the guessing one, to the Pokemon guessing threshold. The default threshold is 0.95, and then the game manager here is just, this is also setting a default value for it, and just has the extra get threshold and set threshold so I can get these values across. I did a little pass on the UI to make it look a little bit better. So now the options are split up into these separate menus. And the generation toggles, they're now buttons instead of just check marks. They function exactly the same. It's just that they're no longer toggles, like with a little check mark. I moved silhouettes in here, and that is also changed into like a button toggle. And threshold is still in here, but it looks a little different. And then if I go to the play screen, I changed this a little bit, so now it kind of looks a little bit like a Pokédex. I forgot to disable those, but these are supposed to be off. I moved the like wrong and right to LEDs on the Pokédex. So here is that actually in action. And then say I got this wrong, I'll just say Ralts again. So I just thought that that would look a little bit cleaner. And I might extend that duration a little bit, but overall, I think it looks a lot better than it did before. I'm not very good with UI, so this is about as far as I can take it at the moment. But it's looking a lot better. After handing the application to my little brother and watching him play it, I decided I needed to put a little work into the algorithm that I used for checking if you had the right answer. For what I'm using right now, I'm literally just taking each character one at a time and seeing if they're equal to each other. And at first, this was good enough, but once you actually notice a few examples where it doesn't really work well, it really doesn't work at all. For example, if you're guessing Ghastly, and you spell it Ghastly, that's only one letter off from the right answer. And if you had your threshold set lower, you would expect you would get that right, because, you know, the threshold should allow for a little bit of difference. While we can look at that and see that there's only a one-letter difference, the way I was doing it, it checks the G, and it's like, yep, that G is correct, so one correct. Then it checks the A, and it's like, no, you typed an H. And now the entire word is shifted over, so when it's testing to see if you wrote an S, it still sees the A. When it's testing for the T, it sees the S. So it says that the entire thing is wrong, even though realistically, it's not that far off, and it should have been counted as correct. And so, with a little help from Solomon Gumball again, they mentioned something called fuzzy string matching. And a specific version of fuzzy string matching that caught my eye was Demeru Levenstein distance, and I probably butchered that name, but basically, Demeru Levenstein distance is able to take into account additions and subtractions. So if you added an extra character or removed a character, it can take that into account. So in that Ghastly example, it would look at the G and it would say the G is correct. Then it would look at the A and say that you put an H, but if you just subtract that H and you have an A after it, that is correct. And there was only one change needed to turn that Ghastly with an H into the Ghastly without the H. So therefore, you were only one away from the right answer. This is much better for finding examples where you would be correct, but my old algorithm for doing it just would count it as wrong. So I began implementing that. I used some resources online to pull together a Levenstein distance class. I don't entirely understand how it works, but it does, so here's how I implemented it. Basically, I removed all the stuff about turning it into a character array and checking each individual character. And then all I'm doing now is taking the distance and setting that to an integer. And then down here, when I'm actually doing the check, I am taking the length of the Pokemon's name, subtracting the distance from that, and then dividing that by the Pokemon name's length. And this basically gives me what I had before, where that's the amount that are correct out of the amount that could be correct, and then it's still being checked with the threshold. And then up here, I had to add this dot remove to remove the last character, because when I was pulling the text from the input text, apparently there was an additional character on the end, blank space on the end. So I just have to remove that for the Levenstein distance to work properly, and there we go, it just works. After a long time, I was able to get the options menu to actually save its options. So if you look here, I'm going to deselect all these, I'll go into extra, I'll move the threshold down there. And then if I go back out, back in, yeah, that saves, that's normal. But now if I turn the application off and turn it back on, the options persist. And I already checked, this does work on the phone as well. So, onto the code. I had to change the way that a lot of the scripts worked in order to implement this change, so a lot of stuff is different and there's going to be a lot to go over, but basically, I moved all of the option menu variables into one class called options_config, and now the game manager and the toggles script use options_config instead of all the individual variables, which makes it much easier to transfer between them. The UI controller now uses the options_config getter and setter functions to transfer the variables. Now, instead of just transferring the variables, it also saves them to an external file. And the game manager was slimmed down a ton because it didn't need all those getters and setters, it just has the one. And then over here into saving, I had to watch a couple tutorials to figure out how to do this, so I'm not going to be very good at explaining how this actually works, but I can say how it's used at least. So right here, this is a static class, so it can be used from anywhere without an object reference. You just call options_config.save, you give it a config class and a string for the name that you want the file to save as. Then it does a bunch of this JSON utility stuff and Newtonsoft.json stuff. writes it to a file and tells you where it's saved in the debug. For loading the files, it's a little bit more complicated. What happens when you call load is it sets the options config to the one that's in the JSON file, but if it can't find the JSON file, then it creates a new options config with all the default values. And then all this is JSON, Newtonsoft JSON, and JSON utility stuff to read from the file, and then this is just a catch for if the file is not found. And this is where you actually pull the information from the save file. And that's about as much as I can explain. I'm now going to move on to trying to modify the guessing and the Pokemon selector so that it saves what Pokemon that you have already gotten correct, so that it doesn't give you them multiple times. And also set up an area in the options menu where you can reset that progress so you can get the ones that you have already gotten correct over again. And it's time to work on that. So it's officially been a couple of months since I last recorded anything for this project. I did do work on it, but it's been so long and I forgot to record it that I don't remember what I did exactly. But the data save, delete, and load, I think for the most part, all of this is very similar to the options save and load system, which I think I've already been over. But anyway, that means that the application is, for the most part, done. So I gave some friends a copy of the game to test it out, and I got a list of things back that I need to work on. So first of all is actually one of the images, Pyroar, was not done correctly. This image is not done correctly, so I have to fix that. There's a bug where if you press the submit button a lot, it submits a lot. So this is Kyogre, and if I just spam submit, all of those were marked as correct, even though they were wrong. So I need to fix that, because that's a major problem. And just to show you that it is, in fact, getting rid of them, Cleavor. And just like that, out of Pokemon. Because it's counting them all as correct, even though only the first one was correct. So I need to fix that. And another thing that I need to do is to add a confirm button. So right now you just press reset all of them are reset. There's no confirmation. If you accidentally press this, you have to restart. So I need to add a confirmation button for that. Let's get into it. Quick changes, I fixed the image, but also I added a simple boolean called checking. And then at the start of the write, I check if checking is not true. And then the first thing I do is set it to true, so that when this gets run again, it won't go through this again. And then at the end I make checking false, so then it resets. And then here's it working. There we go. Oh, wow, I didn't even record an outro for this. Man, I really wasn't prepared. Well, I'll be posting the update video for this later this month, so subscribe.